Today, in the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahido Church, we remember Debre Zeyit, the Mount of Olives. It is a quiet day in the calendar, not a day of great celebration, not a day of mourning, but a day of understanding. Because the Mount of Olives stands at the threshold of the greatest mystery in Christianity. From this mountain, one sees Jerusalem spread below, the city of prophets, the city of promises, the city where destiny unfolds. But the Mount of Olives is not the place of crowds. It is the place where Christ withdrew to pray. Night after night, while the city slept, he climbed this slope in silence. The Gospels tell us that during his final days in Jerusalem, Christ often spent the nights on the Mount of Olives, returning to the city each morning to teach. It was here that he withdrew from the noise of the crowds to enter the quiet of prayer. Nearby lies the Garden of Gethsemane, where the most intense prayer of his earthly life would later unfold, the prayer that preceded his arrest. But the Mount of Olives was also a place of teaching. From this very mountain, Christ spoke to his disciples about the destiny of the world, about vigilance, faith, and the mysteries of the end of the age. And the story of this mountain does not end with the cross. After the resurrection, it was from the Mount of Olives that Christ ascended into heaven in the presence of his disciples. Thus, the mountain becomes a threshold place, a place between earth and heaven, between prayer and sacrifice, between the hidden struggle of the night and the revelation of divine glory. There are moments in history when everything seems still, but the greatest decisions are already being made. Debre Zeyit represents such a moment. Here, the path toward the cross was not imposed, it was accepted. Christian faith teaches that the descent of God into the world had a purpose, not simply to teach, not simply to heal, but to confront the deepest reality of human existence, death itself. And death cannot be defeated from outside. It must be entered. On the Mount of Olives, the Gospel tells us that Christ prayed in anguish, not because he did not know what awaited him, but because the weight of that moment touched the fullness of his humanity. In that prayer, we see something extraordinary. God does not face suffering with indifference. He faces it fully, consciously, and freely. The mountain, therefore, becomes a place of decision. From this place, the road leads directly to Gethsemane, to arrest, to judgment, and finally to the cross. But Debre Zeyit also carries another meaning in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. It marks the midpoint of the Great Fast. Ekule Tsom, half the journey of Lent has passed, half remains. The Church pauses here, as if standing on a ridge between two valleys. Behind us lies the effort already made, the discipline of fasting, prayer, and reflection. Before us lies the road that leads toward Holy Week. And so this day asks a quiet question of every believer. Where do you stand on this path? The Mount of Olives reminds us that the most decisive battles are not fought with armies. They are fought in silence, in the stillness of prayer, in the quiet moment when a human being chooses truth over fear, faith over comfort, sacrifice over escape. Before the cross, there was a moment of silence. Before the resurrection, there was a moment of acceptance. And on that mountain, the path towards the salvation of the world quietly began its final descent. Today, the Church remembers that mountain, not only as a place in Jerusalem, but as a place within the human heart. For every person who walks the path of faith must one day stand on their own Mount of Olives. Debre Zeyit reminds us that history is often changed not in noise, but in prayer. In many spiritual traditions, Mountains carry a special meaning. They are places where heaven and earth seem to meet. The Mount of Olives carries that same symbolism in the Gospel story. Here Christ prayed in the silence of the night. Here he prepared for the sacrifice that would confront death itself. And here, after the resurrection, he ascended toward heaven in the sight of his disciples. Thus, the same mountain witnesses both descent and ascent. First, the descent of divine love into the suffering of the world. Then the ascent of humanity toward the promise of eternal life. For this reason, the Mount of Olives stands like a bridge between two realms, between the earthly city of Jerusalem below and the horizon of heaven above, between the silence of prayer and the fulfillment of salvation. And so the Church remembers the Mount of Olives, not only as a place in Jerusalem, but as a place within the human heart. For every person who walks the path of faith must one day stand on their own Mount of Olives, a moment of silence before the road ahead becomes clear. A moment when prayer becomes decision. From that mountain, Christ began the final descent toward the cross, toward the defeat of death, and toward the promise of resurrection. Debre Zeyit reminds us that the turning points of history are not always made in the noise of crowds or in the halls of power. Sometimes they begin in silence, on a mountain, in prayer, with a single, quiet yes.